Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our event today on behalf of our board of directors here at the Jerusalem Fund. I'd like to welcome you to the release of our report, When Settlers Attack. Before I jump into our presentation today, just want to note to those watching online that you can send in your questions if you have any questions once we get into the question and answer period, or comments via Facebook on our live stream page, or via Twitter by tagging at Palestine Center. And we'll do our best to address any of the questions that you have. Just a little bit of background about this particular report and this topic. Some of you who have been at the Palestine Center events on settler violence before will know that this is an issue that we've been working on for some time now. This is the third event that we do on settler violence. In the past, once we had begun putting together a database on settler violence, we had done some preliminary events, and at the end of our last event, we had promised that we are putting forward a comprehensive report on Israeli settler violence, and I'm happy to say that that is why we are here today, to release this report and its findings, and to address any questions, and hopefully to advance the discussion on Israeli settler violence and help those who formulate policy in finding ways to help prevent it. Let's just get started now. This image that you see is on the cover of the report. The report, by the way, is being sent out electronically. It's probably available right now online, so that it can be downloaded later and read in its entirety. It's very heavy on information and numbers, and so what I'm going to go over today is kind of an overview of what the report includes. So I'm going to be talking today about the data, some of the trends that we saw, why we believe from looking at this settler violence happens, and how we tested different explanations for settler violence. We're also going to talk a little bit about the price tag narrative, and then talk about the appendix and some of the data included in the appendix in our report. So the data we used comes from a few different sources. Primarily, the data comes from something called the Palestine Monitoring Group, which is a collection of civil society and security agencies within the Palestinian Authority's Negotiation Support Unit. We used this data for keeping track of events of Palestinian violence and settler violence, primarily because it was the best available daily data on events. When looking at this issue, we wanted to understand settler violence at a very nuanced, very detailed level, and so we wanted data on a day-to-day basis, but also on a very nuanced scale when it comes to location. We wanted to know which villages and which settlements were most involved. We didn't want some broader aggregate data, but we wanted something specific that we could then look at very carefully. And so the data from the reports of the Palestine Monitoring Group was most useful for that. We also coded media roundups from the Foundation from Middle East Peace to put together variables that I will discuss later. And also the report includes a section showing areas where settler violence occur, superimposed on a map that was produced by B'Tselem in the past, that I found to be the best when looking at the contrast between areas A, B, and C. And that's something that we will discuss further as well. So the numbers that we have, the events that we have, are events coded from September of 2004 to December of 2011. So we really coded everything that we had available. These reports began in terms of being written and being available on a daily basis in September of 2004. So we collected everything that we possibly could to look at settler violence over this period, and we stopped for this report at the end of December of 2011 to kind of round out the year. But we continue to record up-to-date instances of settler violence and so on, so that we can expand the database. This report covers September 2004 to December 2011. The database contains over 10,000 events, including 3,700 instances of settler violence. And so when we look at all this information, we're able to identify three really important trends. And these are trends that are highlighted within the report. I'm going to go through them individually. The first is the general trend over time. The second is a geographic trend. And the third is trends that we see in tactics that are being used. When we look at the general trend over time, there's one thing that is very, very obvious, and that is that it continues to increase year after year, particularly since 2006 onward, where we see really a dramatic spike. And this is an absolute number of events year after year. Last year, in April, we had an event on settler violence where we were able to look at data only up to the first couple months of 2011. And from that point, we had said that it seems that 2011 was going to be the most violent year on record as far as settler violence is concerned. And it turns out that even though we only had 2 years of data, those trends continued, that proved to be correct, as we saw a 39% increase in the number of settler violence incidents from 2010 to 2011. And importantly here, a 315% increase from 2007 to 2011. So over that 5-year period, we saw a very significant increase in settler violence. Interestingly, over that same 5-year period, the past 5 years, we see something like a 95% decrease in Palestinian violence in the West Bank. And so that is important information to note when we talk about why settler violence happens, and we'll be getting to that later on as well. The second trend that we notice is a geographic trend. In the past, all documentation of settler violence that we've seen, particularly prior to 2009, situated settler violence primarily within the southern half of the West Bank, much of it happening in the city of Hebron. What's unique about the city of Hebron is it's one of the only areas outside of Jerusalem, of course, in the West Bank, where you have settlers literally living inside of a Palestinian city. And so the opportunities for settler violence were clearly greater in those areas, and we had seen in the past settler violence happening predominantly there, more than any other governorate. That is no longer the case. In fact, we have noticed a trend of settler violence shifting north, with Nablus now overtaking Hebron as the governorate that sees the largest portion of settler violence, even though we still see, of course, far too much settler violence in Hebron. We are seeing more now in Nablus than before, and the trends in other northern districts like Qalqilia, like Tulkarem, and Salfit and so on are also on the rise. This chart just shows you two polynomials that kind of graph the trends of Nablus and Hebron over the span of our database, and you can see that while, of course, Hebron continues to be very significant, it has tapered off, while attacks in Nablus are on a consistent rise. So these are the sorts of geographic trends that we're seeing. The third trend that I'd like to talk about is trends in tactics. Some of these are a little bit less pronounced than the other trends, but nonetheless apparent. Two that I want to highlight in particular are instances of arson, which were 6% in 2005 and have nearly doubled to 11% of all settler violence attacks in 2011. Stone throwing is also up from 20% in 2005 to 32% in 2011. Again, this is the attack type as a proportion of total attacks. So in terms of tactics, we can say that settlers are using arson now more often than they used to as a form of violence against Palestinian civilians. This chart kind of gives you a breakdown of the top incident types, and they're stone throwing, arson, destruction of property, vehicular attacks, shooting, physical attacks, and then 25%, the remainder, is a variety of other different types of methods that we group together under miscellaneous. All of this information is included in detail in the report. And so, why does settler violence happen? This is one of the important questions that we hope to try to answer once we collected this data. And there is sort of three explanations for why settler violence happens. And they fall under two categories. One is a category of responsorial explanations. And the other is the category of structural explanation. And so as far as the responsorial category goes, there's sort of two ideas that explain why settler violence happens. And the first one is that settler violence is a response to Israeli government actions. So this is something we often hear reported about, particularly as of late in the media. If the Israeli government dismantles an outpost or prevents settlers from taking over a house or takes some sort of step which is adverse to the ideology of settlers, that settlers respond by putting a price on these actions, trying to create a price for the Israeli government by using violence against Palestinian civilians. This is often called the price tag violence. And so that is one responsorial explanation. The other is that settler violence is a response to Palestinian violence. Settlers see an act of Palestinian violence and feel the need to respond by using violence against Palestinian civilians. As on the structural end of the explanations, there's the idea that settler violence is a product of demographics and security arrangements, which is something that is constant and not necessarily a response to sporadic events. And so what we wanted to do was test the various explanations to the extent that we could using the data that we collected. And the way that we did this is we coded different variables for Israeli government actions. And we actually divided these into two categories. Israeli government announcements, which were basically any time that the Israeli cabinet, the Israeli Knesset, or the Supreme Court made an announcement or decision that is adverse to settler ideology, whether it is the announcement of a dismantlement of an outpost or what have you. And we coded a separate variable for Israeli government executions, which would be the actual dismantlement of those outposts, the actual carrying out of the orders announced by the different facets of the government. And we also coded Palestinian violence. We coded Palestinian violence in the West Bank, and we coded Palestinian violence in Gaza or emanating from Gaza, the vast majority of which were rocket attacks. To understand how these things interact with settler violence or whether or not they are involved in making settler violence go up or down in any way. What we found, which was really interesting, is that Palestinian violence has a significant relationship with settler violence, but it's actually a negative one. And what that tells us is when Palestinian violence goes up, settler violence actually goes down. And that's a relationship that proved to be statistically significant over 369 different cases. And that is an interesting fact that warrants further investigation. But one initial hunch in that direction is that after an instance of Palestinian violence, for example, settlers may be told by the military administration, the occupation, the Israeli army to stay in their houses, to not respond because the response is coming from the Israeli army. So it's not that there is not, of course, an Israeli response, but that response is coming from the army or what other policing authorities there are in the West Bank and are not coming from the settlers. However, when we look at Israeli government actions, particularly Israeli government executions, they have a significant and positive relationship with settler violence. So to an extent, the price tag theory proves to be the one that is most supported by the evidence that we have in the report. The problem is that the models that we have created using these different variables leave a lot to be desired, because there is still very much variation in settler violence that exists outside the cases where you have these different variables taking place. It's only in 15% of the different weeks that we look at where you have instances of Israeli government executions taking place. Outside of that, we still see a tremendous amount of settler violence and a tremendous amount of variation. So even though Israeli government executions do lead to increases in settler violence, it really explains a very small portion of the overall phenomenon. Something else is going on. And to try to test the other explanation, the structural explanation, we turn now to mapping the violence by looking at the data that we have for settler attacks, which settlements attack which villages, and then superimposing that on maps of the West Bank that also show us security jurisdiction in areas A, B, and C. And so we look at each governorate, and by doing this, what you're able to see over a number of different cases is that settlers, and this is a really good example that I've included here. I've only included one in this presentation, but there is a map like this for every single governorate included in the actual report. What you see is that settlers are not just attacking Palestinian targets, but the location of these Palestinian targets matters. Take, for example, the settlement of Bracha, which is located right here. The arrows that you see show you the directions in which they are most commonly attacking the Palestinian villages that they predominantly target, which is the village of Iraq Burin and Burin down here. And what we see is, even though the settlement of Bracha is located much closer to the city of Nablus, the outskirts of which begin right here, where there is a plethora of Palestinian targets for them to attack, they opt overwhelmingly to travel to villages further away, but in a different security jurisdiction, to carry out these attacks. So the Nablus, which is the city here in the dark blue, is located in this security perimeter, this color here, which is Area A. This is an area where Palestinians are in charge of security jurisdiction. If a settler enters into Area A, and this happens sometimes, for example, to visit Joseph's tomb, which is in the Area A around Nablus, those have to be coordinated with Palestinian security. If they're not, settlers are subject to either arrest or some other use of deterrent force, like getting shot at or getting beaten or being forcibly arrested or what have you. So that deterrent matters. That deterrent exists in Area A. It does not exist in Area B, and it certainly does not exist in Area C, where the Israelis have security jurisdiction. And what we've found is that 90% of all settlements, which have been, of all villages, Palestinian villages, which have been attacked multiple times, 90% of them are in areas under Israeli security jurisdiction, either Area B or Area C. So what this really tells us is that these attacks are happening because there is nothing preventing them from happening in the vast majority of cases. And this is largely because the Israelis, which are the authority that is supposed to be protecting Palestinian civilians in the areas where they have security jurisdiction, are not. There's a reason why, and I'm going to just return to this image here on the front. There's a reason why we included this picture here as the cover image for our report, because I feel it really appropriately captures the main reason behind settler violence. What you're looking at here is the Palestinian village of Urif, which is in the governor of Nablus on the map that I just showed you, and we'll go back from that. We'll go back to that. But the angle at which you're looking at it, this picture is actually taken from the nearby settlement of Yitzhar. It is 3,500 feet away, and there is absolutely nothing preventing settlers from Yitzhar to walk right up to the Palestinian village, light things on fire, commit acts of violence, throw stones, what have you. And so that proximity and the lack of deterrent is what enables settlers to carry out the attacks on such a regular basis on these villages. Whereas if you are a Palestinian villager from Arif, you cannot walk up to the settlement of Yitzhar without meeting a security perimeter and security guards which are present around every Israeli settlement. And so given that there is that constant void of deterrence, you can easily understand why a settler can walk down the hill and carry out whatever act that they want if the Israeli authorities respond at all to these events. If they respond to it in a proper manner, it is almost always far too late. And we often find that when they do respond, they respond by intervening on behalf of the settlers. And so there's been plenty that has been written about the problems within the Israeli civil administration and the army's response to violence against Palestinian civilians, about sort of the failures to respond and the way the command structure prevents Israeli military from protecting Palestinian civilians and actually compels them to protect Israeli settlers. Some of that is referenced in our report as well. And so I'll go back here and just show you again Yitzhar, the settlement from which the village of Arif right here is that's the picture at the beginning of the presentation. So you can see that particularly this settlement, even though, this is another important point, even though it is surrounded by Palestinian villages in every direction, which outnumber it in terms of population, which outflank it, of course, from every direction, which in any reasonable strategic context should not be falling victim to this settlement, are on a constant basis to these attacks, particularly because this is fortified due to security jurisdiction and they are literally sitting ducks. And so we wanted to also note that the price tag narrative, which we hear often about in the media, particularly in recent years, as the number of price tag events have increased, as the targets of price tag events have become, and the attacks themselves have become more sensational, with the arson attacks against mosques, with the calling cards left using graffiti, with even attacks against IDF bases and Israeli activists in the West Bank. We hear a lot about price tag violence, but it is improperly described more often than not as really the key motivator, the key enabler of settler violence. That's not the case. The case continues to be that settlers are exploiting the immunity that they have, the impunity that they have, and immunity that they have by attacking in areas under Israeli security jurisdiction. Finally, just a note on what's included in the final section of our report, which is the appendix. Is a very large appendix because we wanted to put a lot of detail in there. We have a detailed list of notable settler violence events just in 2011. It includes a number of different pages of detailed events chronologically to give the reader a flavor of how often these attacks occur. In fact, in 2011, we found an average of 2.7 attacks per day. Where they occur and the extent to which they impede on the livelihood of Palestinian civilians. We also have a table there breaking down the data analysis, which explains the different coefficients and so on of the variables that we tested. We have a list of the most dangerous settlements, which villages they are most often targeting, and what different tactics these settlers from these settlements opt to use. And we have a list of the most vulnerable Palestinian villages. We close our report by making a number of different recommendations to different parties, including the Israeli government, the U.S. government, the Palestinian Authority, and also to journalists which are covering these events. we know what the most dangerous settlements are. We know which are the most vulnerable villages. And we also know that the vast majority of settler violence occurs not as a response to different events, but a failure to proactively prevent these events. Because Palestinian villages are vulnerable and are not being protected, and there is no deterrent for Israeli settlers which commit violence against Palestinian civilians and their property. And so I think I will close there at this point. I'm happy to take any questions that you have about the report or anything that I presented here, or any other aspect of settler violence. Let me just also mention before we get to Q&A that anyone who would like to send in their questions via Twitter or Facebook, you can do so at this time. Again, it can be sent in by tagging at Palestine Center on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you. I liked your presentation. I also like to ask you a question from the perspective of the genesis, historical genesis of the whole settlement event. Isn't it inherent in the word settlers that there's violence in itself? It's not like settler violence, almost like a redundancy, because it's an international law violating practice for which Israel must be punished constructively by the world community.
Yeah, I think your point well taken. There's plenty to be said about the language that we use. I often say that there is it's a big problem, the word settler that we use. In fact, I thought for a while whether to use settlers or colonists within this report. And the reason I ended up using settlers is because I feel like more people sort of can understand what you're talking about a lot quicker when you use that language, just because it's a lot more prevalent. But there is something very, very unsettling about settlers in the West Bank, and any questions about that could be answered by any Palestinian civilian in the West Bank who has to deal with that on a daily basis. So I think you're absolutely correct in pointing that out. Let's go right back here.
Thank you. In the appendix, did you gain any insight into what makes the most dangerous settlements the most dangerous?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that is one that we did not look into too deeply because we looked specifically into the numbers. But I think there is a lot more that needs to be done to understand the role of ideology in all of this. I think when you look, for example, at the settlement of Yitzhar and Bracha, two of them are on the top 10 most dangerous list. These are not settlements that are very large. They are located deep within the West Bank. They have a particularly active and vocal yeshiva there. They have a rabbi that has been particularly vitriolic. And I think that definitely plays a role. However, Yitzhar and Bracha are not the only settlements that have a particularly nasty view towards Palestinian civilians. The fact, I think, especially the settlement that I showed you there, Yitzhar, that it is so high on the list is precisely because that there is so many targets available to it in such proximity that it makes it really quite easy. But ideology, I think, definitely plays a role. It's a lot more difficult of a thing to quantify, though. Let's go right here, and then we'll come over the other side of the room. Just one moment for the microphone.
Do we know the percentage of settlers who are American citizens?
That's a good question. I don't think we have that number offhand. And I don't think the Israeli government is forthcoming about that number as well. I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry. In the back.
Hi, Krista Blackman from Palestine Note. I wanted to ask, is there a trend in the kind of perpetrators? Are they mostly young males, or is it are they mostly unidentifiable?
Unfortunately, more often than not, they're unidentifiable, or we don't have data on them. Within our database of the 3,700 incidents of settler violence that we have from 2004 to 2011, we have data on settlement of origin for about 1/3 of them. So we have about 1,000 cases, or a little over 1,000 cases, where we know which settlement the attackers were coming from. As you can imagine, if you're a Palestinian civilian who is in one of these villages and arrives to their olive grove to find it set on fire, or to find that there is, some kind of vandalism left on your property, whether it's with a note from the settlers or something, a calling card, what have you, it's impossible to tell what settlement they came from because you weren't there to witness it. And so, especially with destruction of property, especially with arson events, these things often happen when either nobody's around or they happen in the dark of night and people discover them the next day or too late to really know who the perpetrator is. So in terms of description, individuals, we certainly don't have. The best we have is settlement of origin, and that's in 1/3 of the cases, approximately.
Dr. Said, do you have statistics about the mortality so that we know, have an idea about the severity of the attacks?
Yeah, and some of those are documented in the report as well. I don't know them off the top of my head. Settler violence it is not the type of violence that leaves scores and scores of people dead. That's not the way that they operate. There's certainly been a lot of casualties due to settler violence, a number of injuries, a number of people who've been killed either by shooting, which is one of the more common types of settler violence that we indicated earlier, and also run over, vehicular attacks. The largest number of casualties are in fact injuries. But the most dangerous part of settler violence is the way it works to intimidate Palestinian civilians, to prevent them from traveling freely without the constant specter of fear going to their olive groves and their villages or what have you. And this is sort of an unbridled form of intimidation that is working as a type of population control in the West Bank, and it's perhaps one of the reasons why it's not limited or prevented by the Israeli authorities. And so without additional walls and without additional borders or what have you, the constant threat of settler violence acts as a form of a barrier between Palestinians and their own land, because of the fear of being attacked and not having anybody that will intervene on your behalf to prevent it. Let's go right here. You've been patiently waiting for a little while.
Never once you mentioned about the Palestinian authorities' policemen. So for it is easily understood that when the settlers are attacking the Palestinian villagers, they are led by the Israeli guards there, because they could and would be treating Palestinians as stepchildren. But isn't there, like, for example, Palestinian police to protect them? Because I remember when I visited Masjid al-Aqsa, for example, after Israeli military guards, there would always be Palestinian police side by side.
Sure.
So how about Palestinian police?
Sure. The way security jurisdiction in the West Bank is really complicated, and the way that it works, and Al-Aqsa, for example, is a completely different case because there are specific security arrangements and agreements in place just for the holy sites. But the way it works more broadly in the West Bank is based on the Oslo Accords and the interim agreements that delineated security jurisdiction into areas A, B, and C. In Area A, which is mostly Palestinian urban centers and some rural areas around Hebron and in Jenin, Palestinians have security jurisdiction. They're responsible for security in those areas. They can have police there. They can have armed armed forces there, soldiers, what have you, people with weapons, law enforcement, essentially, and they're responsible for those areas. Even in those areas, the Israelis often enter at will. I don't want to make the mistake of describing Area A as some sort of autonomous region where security jurisdiction is 100% respected by the Israelis, because that's not the case either. But they have a presence there. In areas B and C, in Area B, the Palestinian Authority has a civil presence but not a security presence. And so any action needs to be coordinated first with Israeli security. Overwhelmingly, it is Israeli security in Area B, and 100% in Area C, their responsibility. They have the final call, the final authority on security in B, and 100% so in C. And so in areas B and C, you don't have Palestinian police that are able to protect these villages in the way that is necessary. And we identify that as one of the main reasons why we see it, why we see settler violence happening. And in fact, 90%, as I mentioned earlier, of villages which face multiple instances of settler violence are in areas under Israeli security jurisdiction, which is areas B and C, which make up the vast majority of the West Bank. I hope that can answer the question a little bit. Let's go here, and then we'll come across there.
Well, sorry. I have two questions, actually. The first one is that in the table, the original graph that you presented, I noticed that in 2011, the increase was greater, within the overall increase, was greater in 2011 than it had been in previous years, the rate of increase, that is, according to what the graph said. And I wondered why that was. And the second question is, did the report, or will subsequent reports deal with the issue of economic violence, the depletion of water resources, and the attacks on olive groves, which are actually meant to make agriculture and therefore living and livelihood untenable in the West Bank?
It's two very important questions. To go back to the chart, this is the chart that you're talking about. The increase from 2010 to 2011 was really, really pronounced. And what accounts for that, I really can't explain. It's just what we noticed. It is part of a trend over time. It certainly doesn't stand out in terms of the general direction of the trend. But yeah, it's a bigger increase from 2010 to 2011 than there was from 2009 to 2010. 2011 started off, and I mentioned this earlier, when we had done an event here in April on this to follow up on a previous event that we did. We noticed very early on that 2011 started out quite violent in terms of settler violence. That was a trend that we noticed early on in the year, that it was on pace to beat out 2010. And, when it is on pace to beat out 2010 that early, it is likely that it will be a significant increase over the previous year, because the majority of settler violence annually, or the largest peak sort of in settler violence annually, happens in the fall, and it coincides with the Palestinian olive harvest. We have a chart that shows that within the report that I didn't put into this presentation. But you see September, October, November, those are the months that see statistically over the different years that we looked at the most settler violence. And so when it starts off so hot in the beginning of the year, and with the predictable spike that you see coming in the fall, we knew early on that it was going to be a pretty bad year. And so, it's hard to tell exactly what motivates it, but, one can only assume that if settlers are continuing to get away with violence and without any penalties for violence, and this, meets whatever their ideological aims are, why would they stop? And so that, that effect of getting away with it and knowing that you can get away with it sort of lends to the idea that over time you're only going to see greater increases. So that's perhaps one idea. Your other question about the devastating toll that it takes on agriculture and the economy. We haven't done anything specific on that other than noting the different instances in which that happens. We don't have a precise count in terms of a dollar figure. What that's done, but you're right. It's done a lot of damage to groves, olive groves, which are a very significant part of the Palestinian agricultural economy, and not only through arson. By the way, we see a number of incidents where there are poisoning attempts on irrigation systems. Particularly in the southern Hebron Hills, we've seen a number of instances like that where they're not even setting trees on fire anymore. They're poisoning the irrigation systems in an attempt to try to, kill off crops. I'm not really sure how successful they've been in that case, but that these have been attempted. These are things that we have noted in the report as having happened. You also see a lot of devastation taking place when it comes to Palestinian livestock. Attacks on sheeps, is something that is pretty common. We've seen a number of instances, and this is perhaps a product of Palestinian shepherds shepherding their flocks near roads. We've seen a number of cases where settlers drive right through a flock and may, take out or injure a number of Palestinian livestock. So, these are things that don't necessarily reflect in terms of casualty figures, but nonetheless have a devastating effect on Palestinian livelihood in its different facets.
What about the deliberate uneconomical use of water on the part of the settlers to deplete the water table?
Yeah, I think it's an important part of the equation as well, something that we would look at outside of settler violence, because that's, of course, orchestrated at a higher level of policy formulation, at the state level. Yes, sir, in the back. We'll get over to you next.
Thank you. I think you partially answered this, but you say there were 10,000 events, of which 3,700 were settler violence. And I guess some of these other 6,300 are things like poisoning or attacking livestock. Are there other significant things? Am I correct in that?
Yes, yeah. The breakdown, which is here, we look at 2011. 2011, in terms of the top event types, is fairly representative over the other years, except for the proportion of arson and stone throwing, which we noticed had changed. But overall, these are the most prevalent sorts of events that we see. There are some miscellaneous events that we lump into one category because they're here or there, whether it may be a kidnapping, for example, which we've seen but haven't seen in large numbers, or the poisoning, for example, which we've seen but not in large numbers, get lumped into that category. I think when you look at the report, though, and you look at the appendix section where we list the different events that we noted that happened in 2011, that'll give you a very good flavor for how often the different types of events happen, where they happen, who they target, who the casualties are, and so on.
But you don't include, say, running over sheep, killing them, as violence, but right?
No, that's included as an incident. Absolutely, that is included as destruction of property. That's one of the 3,700. The 10,000 variables that we have, and this is perhaps something that what we wanted to do is understand the relationship between Palestinian violence and settler violence. And to do that, we needed to record, over the same period of time, instances of Palestinian violence. And we recorded Palestinian violence in terms of individual acts in the West Bank and individual acts emanating from Gaza, to test both variables separately within the same model to see if they have different effects. It's only natural to assume that settlers will be responding differently to an attack that's closer to them in the West Bank than they may to a rocket that is arbitrarily launched from Gaza. But to evaluate both, we put them both in the same model. And without getting too much into the specifics of the statistics, which are outlined a little bit further into the report, a large number of the 10,000 of events are individual rocket launches. Each individual rocket we recorded as a separate event so that we could determine what was the response to it if there was a correlated response. Let's go right here, and then we'll go to you in the back, sir, because just one moment for the microphone.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's a difference in the actions of settlers in some of these very old settlements versus the new crazy people who are coming from the United States. I see the older settlers as having believed a lot of the patriotic stuff. It's like moving to a kibbutz or something.
You're asking whether the date of establishment of the settlement
is
telling?
Have different kinds of populations. And the reason I'm interested is because there's a settlement in just west of northern Israel that where a whole number of my relatives live. And the thing that first aroused let me know what was happening was the vitriol that was coming out of their mouths about these cockroaches and people who have to just be done away with and they're not human.
Yeah.
But what I hear from the newer settlers, and those people were there since the settlement started. They came in 45 and they've been there since the settlement started. But I don't see them encouraging any kind of violence.
Mm-hmm.
The new settlers that I've spoken to have more intellectual arguments, and they all say exactly the same things. But there are reasons reasons for having to kill the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly variation from settlement to settlement in terms of ideology, in terms of all different religiosity. These are all different. There are some settlements that are considered secular settlements. There are some settlements which are considered orthodox or ultra-orthodox religious or what have you. We've looked at these different things to see if there's anything that's really telling in that sense. And it's really about location and security jurisdiction and this idea of a lack of deterrence. Remember, there are some settlements that are separated from Palestinian villages by a wall. They can't get there. But then there are a number of settlements that there's nothing between them and those villages, and so it is very easy and natural for violence to occur in that direction because there's no deterrent. And so when you look at the settlements that are behind the wall, they are less active in terms of settler violence, except in instances where they are traveling through roads that go in areas where they pass through Palestinian villages, or Palestinian villages are located on the side of the wall where they pass through. And if you look at a map with the wall, you know that it goes in and out, and there's settlements and villages on both sides of the wall. But by and large, it comes down to sort of the settlers being unrestrained in being able to pick their targets and attack their targets and so on. Let's go to the gentleman in the back.
You mentioned that the report, you made some recommendations to the U.S. and Israeli governments and the Palestinian Authority. Can you elaborate a little bit on those?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I will read some of them to you, or at least give you a gist. Most of our recommendations go to the Israeli government. We feel that they are, by and large, mostly responsible, particularly because the vast majority of these events are taking place in areas where they have security jurisdiction. And it's important to note here that, it's not that Palestinians don't want to have autonomy in the West Bank. The Israelis are not allowing Palestinians to have security jurisdiction in areas B and C. So if you're not going to allow the Palestinians to defend themselves, and you're not going to defend them, even though it's an obligation that you have, something needs to change here. We're going to continue to see this. And so, our first and primary recommendation is that the Israelis should end all settlement construction and ultimately withdraw from all Palestinian territory. But the failure to do this in the interim, however, does not absolve the State of Israel of its obligations to protect Palestinian civilians in the territories that it occupies. We also suggest that they devote policing resources to the settlements that are known to be the largest perpetrators of settler violence. I mean, it comes down to, policing 101. If you have a neighborhood that sees the largest number of a particular type of crime, whether it's murder or robbery or what have you, you're going to send more police cars there, right? I mean, that's just common sense, but that's not the way it works here. In fact, the Palestinian villages that are most vulnerable continue to be most vulnerable. And we haven't seen any changes in terms of the way the Israeli posture is towards protecting Palestinian civilians, which are repeatedly falling victim to the same Israeli settlements over and over again. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we think the Israeli government needs to be doing, which is first and foremost fulfilling its obligations under international law. We're not asking for the moon here. We're just saying that there are obligations that you have to protect these civilians, and you're not doing it. This is why this is happening, and that needs to change. To the United States government, we urge them to press the government of Israel to take these steps and to bring it up in a regular fashion as something that should be going on outside of the negotiations process. If negotiations stall for 10 years or forever, that should not prevent the United States from pressing the Israelis to fulfill these obligations under international law and take practical steps to protect Palestinian civilians, again, if they're not going to let Palestinians protect Palestinians. And to the Palestinians, we think the Palestinian Authority, there are certain steps that it can take too, even if they're not being permitted to police these areas. There are certain resources that they can dedicate to these villages, whether it be through medical supplies, whether it be through resources to document incidents and raise awareness about what's going on, and also sort of precautionary, preventative things like environmentally safe extinguishants, so that if there is an arson attack and there are Palestinians who are waiting on a fire truck that's held up in a settlement somewhere, they can start to respond to these incidents the best that they can under the circumstances that we have. And of course, to journalists, we asked them to take a look at the report and the phenomenon of settler violence in a more representative fashion, and to not misrepresent it as merely a reaction to price tag events or to Israeli government actions, but to represent it as what it actually is, a response to Israeli government inactions.
How likely do you think the recommendations of the Israeli government can be implemented?
Good question. The best that we could do in our position is put together this information, document it, say, hey, this is what's going on. You need to know this is going on. Journalists need to cover this the right way, and these are the responsibilities of different governments. And we feel that by producing this information and by putting it out there, we can hopefully advance the discussion about settler violence to make it a more accurate one, but also push policymakers in a direction where they can address it more appropriately. Let's go right here. Here first, and then we can go back to you, sir.
Hi, this is a continuation of the lady's question here.
Mm-hmm.
The increase in violence, is that a reflection of what type of government they have there since that Netanyahu took office and that increased from 2007 until 11?
We can make all kinds of guesses about that. Unfortunately, from our data, there's only so much we can really say. Because as far as different governments go, from 2004 to 2011, we only have so many different governments, and it's really not enough variation to use that as something to explain. But perhaps when we first did one of these events, we had only coded at that point about 18 months worth from 2000 and 2009 to September 2009 to the end of 2010, I think, at the time. And a lot of that coincided with the period of the 10-month settlement freeze, right, which we know was not really a freeze, but that was the stated policy. And what we saw is during the 10-month period of the freeze, there was a 2-event per week increase in the number of settler violence attempts. However, what we found out later is that was in fact part of a larger trend over time and did not necessarily have anything to do with that 10-month freeze. So unless you have a much larger data set going back a much further period of time, it's a lot harder to tell whether the individual governments, their makeup, their policies have anything to do with settler violence. What I could tell you is that the current government is certainly not doing what is necessary to prevent settler violence, but that doesn't necessarily distinguish them from previous governments either.
It's the same army.
It's the same administration ultimately. It's the occupied territories is still under the same administration.
Just to be consistent and consequential to my opening question/comment, isn't the term Palestinian violence, quote unquote, without contextualization, inoperative, because there's no moral equivalent between violence that is reprisal violence by occupied, innocent, occupied people? Basically, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's certainly a lot that can be said about the language that that we use, and we've written a great deal in the past about why some terms really probably not the most appropriate. For the purpose of this report, we coded Palestinian attacks, and that is how they were documented in the reports of the Palestinian Monitoring Group, and we looked at it specifically to see if they were triggering a response. And so we didn't take a position on the different acts, and some of the acts may be quote unquote terrorism, some of them may be individual acts that are not necessarily politically motivated but maybe motivated for other reasons. Nonetheless, every single one of them had to be coded in our database for this purpose. Let's go back here.
Are any of the areas attacked, do they have historical or particular biblical significance?
You know what? Yes, some of them do, but very few do in terms of the villages. You see different events in the old city of Hebron, for example, some of which may take place around the holy sites there, which are obviously contentious by nature, because you have a site that's revered by all religions, and there are settlers located within the city. But there are a couple different villages, one in particular which has a one of many different prophets or saints was buried there somewhere in the past. Which one I can't tell you right now, but I would think in all three religions. The territory dates back a while, as you know, but there's a Palestinian village there, and settler violence has occurred around visits, unauthorized visits, sort of, or raids to that village under the purpose of pilgrimage or what have you. So yeah, somewhat, but the cases are very few when it comes to that. We're going to just take this last question here before we wrap up.
I wanted to follow up the comments from the gentleman in the back. Maybe you have done it, but anyway, I'd like to mention here. I think it would be a good idea for you to send your reports, especially this report, to the UN and to the Voice of America, because Voice of America is a government-funded organization, so that when they write news about Palestinian and Israelis, they will have more resources about about Palestine and Palestinians. Voice of America, please.
We'll certainly spread this out as far as we can and make sure that first and foremost the different agencies and governments that need to hear about this get this information. We will also be making an effort, of course, to get it out to the media and to Voice of America.
And also to the offices of the presidential candidates like Newt Gingrich and Santorum, who have been very unkind to say about it.
Yeah, I will be sure to send it to all of them, including Newt Gingrich. I'm not sure if he'd acknowledge the existence of this report, but we will certainly send it his way. Yeah. Thank you all very much.